Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the Wake Up Call, the podcast of wake up and strengthen the things that remain. A podcast designed to help Christians be informed and have an idea of what we should be doing in these days in which we are living, understanding the times, the culture we live in, strengthening the things that remain. I'm Tom Short, and joining me is Dr. Rich Suplita, and we'll be glad to have him along and get his comments as well. Well, Rich, it's NCAA tournament time, and there have been a lot of upsets, including our Big Ten has not been doing well, my Big Ten. And my Ohio State Buckeyes were one of the first teams to go down in a major upset to Oral Roberts University. And then the University of Florida went down, and then they barely lost in their next game to Arkansas. But, you know, there's some people didn't even think they should be in the tournament. An op-ed in the USA Today claimed that because this Christian university that held to biblical standards of morality and marriage, they thought that was anti-LGBT hatred. And they said that in the name of diversity and inclusion, big buzzwords in the world today, that the Oral Roberts team should not even be allowed to be in the NCAA tournament. They should not even be allowed to compete with other schools because of their position on the LGBTQ issue. So, Rich, got a question for you. Does this sound like diversity and inclusion to you?
Well, Tom, it definitely does not sound like they're being very inclusive there. In fact, it sounds like what they're doing is they're accusing a Christian university, a Christian college, of in fact holding to Christian principles. And what really stood out to me in the article was the use of the language that they're anti-LGBTQ. And I see this a lot happening. I see this anti-such and such group being applied. And I would say quite obviously what they're doing there is they're using loaded language and loaded terms to play into this narrative that Christians hate certain groups of people.
This type of language is what we call doublespeak. We want diversity, but we don't want to include you in that diversity. We want to be inclusive, but we don't want to include you. We want to be tolerant, but we don't want to tolerate you. In other words, these words are used, but it's not what they mean. And this is happening all over. We're calling it nowadays cancel culture, where if you don't measure up, if you don't fit in, if you don't go by what these certain elite people in our universities and now in our government, what they believe, you're out. You're not included. Diversity doesn't include you. Inclusion doesn't include you. You're now marginalized. Why? Because you held on to what the Bible says is true. And we're now calling evil good and good evil. We've changed light for dark and darkness for light. These are difficult days in which we're living.
Yeah, for sure. So, a thought there that I had about that is going back to the idea with the First Amendment and freedom of speech. You don't need freedom of speech laws to protect popular speech, right? So their definition of inclusive is very exclusive, as it turns out. So I want to move on and talk about Joe Biden. This past week, Joe Biden gave his first formal press conference, and it played out very differently from the Trump press conferences. Maybe that's no surprise. There were relatively few interruptions of President Biden, and in fact, one of the press corps noted that President Biden is a, quote, moral and decent person. Certainly not something you would ever hear them say of President Trump. And so the big issue at hand, of course, was the issue of the filibuster. The media seems to be advocating that the Senate filibuster be something that is overturned, that's done away with. And in fact, Biden was asked directly if he thought that the filibuster was, as Barack Obama had stated, a, quote, relic of Jim Crow. And his answer was an emphatic yes. So, Tom, would you say that the filibuster, was that a racist filibuster when Barack Obama and Joe Biden used it to block the Republican initiatives?
Of course not. We know that only Republicans can be racist. A Democrat and a Republican can do the exact same thing, and the Democrat does it, it's seen as standing up for virtue and what's right. Republican does it, it's seen as racist. What are we talking about here? The filibuster is designed to allow in this great deliberative body of the Senate, to allow the minority party to have a voice and to make sure that the party in power doesn't just push through their agenda without having to deliberate and convince the minority. It requires some bipartisanship. Back in 2005, when the Republicans had a good majority in the Senate, as well as in the House and the presidency, there was the discussion about doing away with the filibuster. Barack Obama made a strong case that to do such would be divisive and a power play and would be wrong, contrary to what the American people would want. Joe Biden got up and gave an hour-long speech on the Senate floor when he was a senator about how wrong it would be to get rid of the filibuster. It would be pure power play. But now that the tables are turned, and now that the Democrats have the Congress and the presidency, and a 50-50 split, and technically they don't even have that. There's 50 Republican senators, 48 Democrat, 2 independent, but the 2 independent ones are caucusing with the Democrats. So essentially we're 50-50. And what they're wanting to do is to be able to push through a radical agenda, a left-wing agenda, and totally apart from any allowing the minority party, the Republicans, to have any say whatsoever, and to push through and have a 50-50 vote, and then the tie-breaking vote would go to Vice President Harris. And they want to push through strong agendas related to taxes, related to gun control, related to climate, related to voting and nationalizing elections. We'll talk about that in a minute. And all these things, which are not even, it's a radical left-wing agenda that has taken over the Democratic Party, and they want to push this through, and they can't get bipartisanship because it's such a radical agenda. And so they want to be able to push it through without having even one single Republican senator go along. This is not racist. What it is saying, let's negotiate. Joe Biden wasn't elected president to radically transform our country, to turn us into a socialist country or anything of this nature. That's not why he is there. He ran as a moderate. He ran as a uniter. He ran as someone who could bring our country back together, not someone who would introduce just raw political power at the total disregard of the minority party. But you know, Rich, the thing that bothers me even more than the power play here, as much as that bothers me, is the overuse of the word racism. When you overuse a word, racism is a bad thing. We all agree on that. Racism is wrong. Let's be very clear about that. We should be like, we're Christians. We want to be judging people on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, as Dr. Martin Luther King said, or as God said and the prophet said to back in Samuel, that God looks on the heart. Man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. We should be people who look on the inner person, past the skin, and look upon the heart. Racism has been a problem in our country, no doubt about it. But when everything becomes racist, then it loses its sting. It loses its punch. It dilutes what the word really means, so that you get to the point that true racism can't be called out. It's like the kid who cried wolf so many times that no one really listened anymore. When you accuse everything of being racist, then real racism, no one is even listening anymore. They don't pay attention. We're in danger of so diluting this word it means nothing. And the overuse of any word like this, it's really wrong. We need to be careful that we don't just call everything racist just to get a political point across. No, the filibuster is not racist. It is part of our legislative process. It's part of the Senate history. It's part of being a deliberative body that keeps the majority from running roughshod over the minority and requiring at least some compromise to bring about bipartisanship.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just thinking there of how the shifting definitions, how commonly that is used. I mean, it is literally Orwellian. You mentioned doublespeak a little while ago, and that's exactly what's playing out. They change the meaning of words. You know, it's been said that if a word can come to mean anything, then suddenly it becomes nothing. And as you point out there, you know, real racism is entails very real injustice, people being harmed in very real ways. But they go around, they apply this term racism to anything and everything, and obviously, as you point out, that the purpose there is a political power grab.
This double standard of accusing people of being racist really is a sad, sad thing. Republicans don't tend to do it because Republicans tend to look at people as individuals rather than look at people by their unchangeable features such as skin color. Democrats are far more into what we call identity politics. And so if you're black or Asian or LGBT or something like this, you ought to think like your group, less as an individual, and more you're expected to agree with your group of these unchangeable qualities, these unchangeable characteristics of you. I don't know how Democrats have been so good at turning this around. They really have been, historically, the Republican Party was founded to oppose slavery. The first Republican president was Abraham Lincoln. He was the first, that's when the Republican Party got started, to oppose slavery. And the Democrats have been on the wrong side of the race issue throughout history. They're the ones who have KKK members in their members throughout history. They're the ones who were for Jim Crow. They're the ones who were in favor of slavery. They're the ones who have opposed civil rights. They're the ones who stood and blocked schoolhouse doors to let a little black girl get in. Somehow they have turned this around by this identity politics idea, and it's not right. And consequently, they accuse people, and any time that you disagree with their policies, you get accused of racism. That's the stock answer. And Republicans don't tend to turn it around and put the shoe on the other foot. We tend to stand there and take and say, no, we look at people as individuals, but Republicans are always on the defensive about that. Now, there was an exception here just recently, and that had to do with Candace Owens. Maybe you've heard of Candace Owens. She wrote the book Blackout. She is a black conservative, a proud black conservative, and quite articulate. If you haven't heard her, you really should listen to some of what she says. Well, she had tweeted recently about the Black Lives Matter and the Asian Lives Matter. And she just in her tweet said, if you're really concerned about black lives, you should realize that most crime committed against black people is committed by other black people. Most crime committed against Asian people is committed by other black people. And that was her tweet. If you're concerned about black lives, Asian lives, let's not blame it on white supremacy. Well, there's a history professor by the name of Liam O'Mara in Southern California. He's actually running for Congress as a Democrat, and dare I say he's probably left of most Democrats. He's pretty far left. But he responded to Candace Owens' tweet by sending a picture of a KKK hood, sending a photo of a KKK hood, and said, here, did you drop this? Now, I don't know what you think about that. Do you think it's okay for a white man to send a black woman a KKK hood? Does that sound right to you? Does that sound any way intimidating? Does that sound like a put down? Does that sound hateful? Well, Candace complained to Twitter. Twitter found no problem with it. No problem with this. No racism here. No hate here. This is fine. And Twitter allowed that tweet to stay there. So she took it to the next level. She said, I think this is a hate crime. And she contacted the police in his district and filed a complaint against him, for which finally he took his tweet down. Because in most states that would be considered a hate crime, and the guy could be in trouble legally. My point is this: not that we don't get him in trouble. We just say, be consistent. Be consistent. Don't overuse this word racism, and if you're going to use it, be real racism. Don't look for, don't blame everything on racism, and be consistent. If it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. If it's racism for a Republican to do it, it's racism for a Democrat to do it, and to be consistent. Well, all this reminds us as another area of potential racism, and that's this. Georgia passed a new election law this week designed to prevent the type of confusion and possibly cheating that occurred in the last election. At the same time, Democrats in Washington are trying to pass H.R. 1, which will federalize elections for national office with just the type of rules that caused so much problem in Georgia, and to make those same rules and standards that were confusing and controversial in Georgia to federalize it for all the states. Democrats say these actions are designed, that what Georgia did is designed to suppress the vote. Rich, I got a question. Is opposition to H.R. 1 an effort to keep people from voting or to keep people from cheating?
Yeah, well, clearly it's an effort to keep people from cheating. And that just, what that brings up is the issue of confidence. When you're talking about a democratic process, something that is truly democratic, then obviously confidence is everything. And right now you have half of the American population, half of the voters in America have virtually zero confidence that their votes are being registered as they voted, and there's not widespread cheating on the other side, fixing of elections through various means. And so clearly this is something that needs to be addressed. But of course, the pushback against that comes in the form of using that term again. Well, that's somehow racist to demand something like a voter ID, or that people who are able to vote in person actually vote in person.
We're being told that to require an ID to vote is racist. Come on, man. You need an ID to do all kinds of things in America today. You need an ID to exercise your Second Amendment right to buy a gun or ammunition. You need an ID to buy alcohol or cigarettes. You need an ID to rent property or buy a house, or to fly an airplane, or to have a bank account, or to enter into most federal buildings, or to drive a car. Who are these millions of people who don't have an ID? If they don't have an ID, let's get them one. Let's have the state provide, if they need, a free a free ID card, so we know who's actually voting, but also so these poor people can participate in the rest of society. Because without an ID nowadays, you can't do hardly anything. And why do we say it's like the only thing that we're worried about is they can't vote? It doesn't pass the sniff test. Let's face it, folks. Our country has been under assault. Our country is under assault. This is what we say: wake up and strengthen the things that remain. Our country needs to reestablish integrity, and one of the things is integrity in elections. What in our country has not had its integrity questioned? And which institutions in our country has the political left, the radical left, have they not sought to destroy? The family, the church, government, our Wall Street, our business, the things that have made us prosperous, the borders around our country. You go on and on and on. The military, the FBI, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, the YMCA. All of these things have come under assault, and the effort to radically transform them. And somewhere we've got to draw the line, and that line just might be, if we lose election integrity, will we even have a country left? Some people may be happy with that. Some people they believe that we have such systemic problems, that America is so irredeemably evil that the whole country must be destroyed. We better realize there are people who think that way, and people who are trying to make that happen. I'm trying, personally, I'd like to retain what we have. I think our country, and we've had good elections. We've had good elections. In this last year, because of the pandemic, there was all kinds of changes that were made. People could vote without having to show up, without having to show an ID. They could just drive by and drop off a ballot in a drop-off box. People could go and collect ballots from people in their homes and then just turn them in in mass without any kind of evidence, without any kind of proof that from the other side, where both sides were watching, to know that these ballots were cast legally. Folks, these things can't continue. We want every person who has the right to vote to be able to vote. Every citizen in America to have the right, everyone over 18 has the right to vote, and we want them to be able to vote, but it must be done legally. Enough of the cheating, enough of the dead people voting, enough of the voting more than once, enough of the ballot harvesting and things of this nature. And the things that had caused such problem in Georgia and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Arizona, some of these states, some people want to take it federal. It's going to undermine the integrity of our elections. You may not have a problem with it, but tens of millions of Americans do. And if we're going to figure out how to live together and get along, we better figure this one out. When I raised the question of voter cheating, of election officials cheating in this last election, boy, I got pushback from people. People who thought the police, they're bad, but those who run elections, they're good. Politicians are good, but they're good, they wouldn't dare cheat. Who would expect a politician to cheat, right? So I got so much pushback in that. Rich, do you think people who run elections, do you think people would cheat when it comes to an election?
Well, I would have to ask the question. We are Bible-believing Christians, and as part of that, Scripture plainly reveals that humankind is fallen, and part of that is what? It's deceit, that we lie for our own purposes. People cheat on their taxes, people cheat on their spouses, people cheat their employers. Now, of course, there are ethical people, but we're talking about the normal state of fallen humanity is to be unethical, to deceive. And clearly, why would we think that people are prone to being unethical, cheating the system in all these other ways, but when it comes to elections, they're going to be completely upright and honest? That's clearly absurd to think that.
This leads to our next question, Rich. In Atlanta last week, a man shot and killed 8 people who worked in 3 different massage parlors. 6 of the 8 were Asian. The alleged shooter was a visitor to these massage parlors and said he was battling sex addictions that just caused him to snap. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and the entire mainstream media painted this as an anti-Asian hate crime. Well, Rich, I know you're not into fomenting racial hate and division in our country, so I want to ask you, as a psychologist and a Christian, do you think people really do battle with sexual addictions?
Oh, absolutely. And, we can't emphasize that enough. And to me, that is the real problem with trying to spin some type of race narrative there, because what that does is it completely overlooks this enormous problem, this growing problem, this devastating issue in the United States of pornography, child pornography in many instances, human sex trafficking. This happened in Atlanta. Of course, I'm from sort of the greater Atlanta metro area, so I'm exposed to a lot of stories. And, Atlanta, a lot of people don't realize this, is one of the main hubs in the United States, not just regionally, but in the United States for human sex trafficking. So I think we have, as a psychologist, that was my background academically, I think we have every reason to believe this young man that his main motivation was, in fact, a sexual addiction. It was one that he was receiving inpatient, like in-house counseling as part of a recovery program. He had relapsed before. He had expressed this to some of the people closest to him. So to me, that is the real problem. That's where the narrative, we want to improve society. We want to push back against some of these social evils. What we need to focus on here is the issue of things like sex trafficking.
Folks, the shooting in Atlanta really does help us to see what's really going on in our culture and the cultural conflict. What is the problem in America? Now, we all agree it was wrong. We all agree there are problems in America. What are the problems? I'd have to say the problem goes back to our rejection of God. That we have been a nation historically that was founded under God, had the light of God, sought to please God, feared God, and we've walked away from that. And now we look for other things to blame, other issues, we've got to find other problems to solve that while ignoring the real problem of rebellion against God. Why do I think this is the bigger issue? Well, the Bible tells us that that's the issue in Romans 1, verse 18. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident to them. God made it evident to them. Therefore, they have no excuse. And therefore, and when we turn away from God and receive the lie, trade the truth of God for the lies of men, what's the first area that's given over into? We are given over in Romans 1, given over to sexual immorality, that our bodies might be dishonored amongst us. And so here's a guy who is claiming he was given over to sexual immorality. And he's claiming that it had taken over, he was addicted to it. But rather than deal with that issue, because that would go against this idea of personal autonomy and sexual, that we can do whatever we want sexually and there's no boundaries there. But God says there are. And God says there are boundaries there. We have, in the 60s, our nation entered into or embraced what we call the sexual revolution. And the sexual revolution basically said, all you need is love, do whatever you want. It's, of course, led to now, you don't even need love anymore. Just all you need is a Tinder app or something like that. But the cry in those days was question authority. And every bit of our culture was under assault. Question the government. Question your teachers. Question institutions like marriage. Question the church. Question God. All of these institutions and everything that we once held dear was under assault. This is why we have called this podcast, Wake Up and Strengthen What Remains, because all of these things have been so attacked. And in our day and age, let's realize that this sexual immorality has created such a tremendous problem in our country. Every now and then something will pop up its head like this Atlanta shooting, and you say, is there sex addiction real? But the real problems, folks, it is real, and the real issues are usually more hidden. Look at all the people with millions and millions and millions of people with sexual addictions to pornography. Millions and millions and millions of young people who've been exposed to pornography way before they are able to handle it, and now have all kinds of twisted views about the opposite sex or about their own bodies. Look at the abortions, the divorces, the STDs, the broken hearts, the distrust. This is a big, big problem in America. It may be one we can never come back from, to be honest. It may be one we can never come back from. Embracing the sexual revolution and allowing it to take root in our schools, in our entertainment, indeed in our families, indeed in our lives, even in our churches. It really has been the destruction of our country. Don't let it happen to you. Don't play with fire. When it comes to sexual temptations, stand firm, stand strong. Don't give in to it. It's destroying people all around us. Don't let it destroy you. Now, we do want to be clear that the fellow in Atlanta did not do the right thing. We don't blame others for our problems. We don't call ourselves victims. He claimed to have a sexual addiction and to be all wrapped up in it. You don't blame the girl for that. You don't blame someone else. You don't blame the availability of sin. You take responsibility. I sinned. I made mistakes. I've done wrong. You don't think you're going to get rid of your addiction or your problem by going and shooting the person that tempts you. That's not the answer. He was wrong, wrong, wrong. But this sexual immorality that is so prevalent, and indeed, very likely those girls were being sex trafficked. The problems that this has brought upon our culture, it's destroying us at the very foundations. Psalm 11 verse 3 says, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? And the answer is, I don't know. Our country's gotten pretty far down the cesspool of immorality, and we reap what we sow. there are consequences to our choices. Let's you and I make sure it doesn't get us. Let's you and I stand strong in this really, really filthy world. Let's make sure we don't get defiled. Let's stand strong. Let's pray over and protect our kids, our family, our spouses, our people in our church. Pray for your pastor. Pray for your church members, because this is invading, all this stuff is invading our families and our churches. It's invaded our country. It's dangerous. Yes, sexual temptation, sexual addiction, or I would call it, Jesus said, if you commit sin, you become a slave of sin. He called it addiction. I'd call it sexual slavery. And more people are slaves of the sins of sexual immorality, adultery, pornography, fornication, and others than we think.
Yeah, so I would just say, you're spot on. How irresponsible of the media. We have this crisis, this major issue, sex trafficking, pornography, in many cases, child pornography, but it gets completely ignored in favor of their pet narrative. And so I think in this situation, that was, you want to speak about injustice. That's an injustice. Injustices that are being committed against the victims of sex trafficking in this instance. It needs attention. It doesn't get the attention that it deserves because a different narrative is being embraced. So, Tom, we want to make sure that we talk about something positive, and so I'll ask you here, do we have any victories recently that we can celebrate?
Rich, this week's good news comes to us right here from the state of Ohio, where in a unanimous ruling, the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that Shawnee State University professor Nicholas Meriwether's rights to free speech were violated, and his rights to freedom of religion were violated because he refused to use preferred pronouns of one of the students in his class. Now, he'd been willing to call the person by their preferred name, but he said that God assigns our sex at birth, and he was unwilling to call a fella by the female pronouns preferred, and was reprimanded and punished by the university for doing so. He filed a case with the Alliance Defending Freedom in federal court, and although first a judge threw it out, yet the federal Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, the second highest court next to the Supreme Court, 13 appeals courts in America, right below the Supreme Court, ruled unanimously that his rights to freedom of speech and freedom of religion were violated, and it clears the way for him to sue the university for damages for having reprimanded and punished him. This is a victory. I've long contended, not just in this thing about transgenders, but all of us, we need to see ourselves the way God sees us. Not the way we feel, not the way of our circumstance, but we need to walk the way God declares us to be. Christian, you and I need to walk as if we're children of God, forgiven, redeemed by God, as if we're saints of the Most High God, ambassadors for Christ. You need to believe that whether you feel that way or not. Likewise, all of us need to accept and embrace the way God made us, and not force others to enter into a delusion if we refuse to believe the science of how God has actually made us to be physically. Second good news that we want to remind ourselves, hey, we're coming upon Holy Week. This is our week, friends. This is the week we remember, the week that changed the world, the week Jesus Christ gave his life for us. He entered into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, gave us communion or the Lord's Supper on Thursday, was betrayed, tried, crucified on Friday, rose again from the dead on Sunday. This is Holy Week, and I'd like to remind us, this is our week. Let's stand triumphant, victorious. Let's believe that we are victors, and let's live in light of the victory gained for us by our Lord Jesus Christ. Which reminds me that I have another podcast that I do each morning in which I go through the Word of God in prayer. This next week, we'll be studying the events of Holy Week. I invite you to search YouTube, find Tom the Preacher, and there you can join me for daily Word and daily prayer, sure to transform your life if you're with me in the Word every day. And I hope you can join me and that you will. You can also find that on podcast, Apple, Spotify, and Google. Again, it would be under the Tom Short Show. So I want to thank you for joining us. That's it for this week's edition of Wake Up, and strengthen the things that remain. A message to Christians about what's happening in our world and how we need to be alert and we need to be strong, mighty for God in these days. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to you joining and seeing you again. Help spread the word. We'd love to see this podcast grow. God bless you. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you on our next edition of Wake Up and Strengthen the Things That Remain.